First, I just want us to grieve. I just want to grieve the people who have had to die alone. And I want to grieve with the many who cannot be at the bedside of somebody that they love. Let's grieve for the 50,000 people who are gone. Rabbis, Holocaust survivors, people from every walk of life, disproportionate amount, people of color, Americans, people who all just wanted to live their lives, of course, people across the globe. I think we begin by just taking in the staggering amount of loss. We'll name it, but we won't pretend we have all the words. And I also want to grieve the ongoing economic tragedy, the businesses and the agencies and the communities and the artists trying to exist, and some are collapsing under the strain. The millions of people without work, without a way to be secure, worried about healthcare bills, worried about paying for groceries. I want us to allow ourselves to feel the deep insecurity. Some of us already feel it, and I want to feel it of the many. The many our country has failed, often with our tacit support. Let us take in the enormity of the pain and the fear and the loss. And let us understand that any system that regularly and predictably elicits pain and fear from a large portion of its people, for pretty much the same portion of the society, when that happens, whether we admit it or not, it infects us all. So we begin with grieving, and let us not be distracted from what we see, no matter how many times we hear about it or how difficult it is. I don't want us to look away at how much has crumbled. We have to start by grieving our collective loss. Turns out there's a conversation recorded in the Talmud about some students who are also mourning a loss. And they're mourning the destruction of the temple. And I have something to admit, because as many times as I've heard about and taught about and even ritualized the destruction of the temple, as many times as I visited the ruins in Jerusalem, I never felt real sadness over it. I understood the loss intellectually. I understood that to lose the place where everyone went for all the festivals and the pilgrimages and the experiences, I understood the loss was catastrophic. I just never felt it. It wasn't until last week when I realized that we in our community of the kitchen will likely not be gathering for a very long time, maybe a year, maybe more. And thank God the situation is not permanent. But thinking about how hard it was to build, and then thinking of no Shabbat in person for a very long time, no holidays, life cycles very different. It wasn't until that moment that I think I started to feel a measure of what it must have been like when the temple was destroyed. A previously inconceivable loss, a resounding loss. But back to the story in the Talmud, there are these students who, after the temple is destroyed, they're grieving, and so they tell Rabbi Yehoshua that they're no longer going to eat meat because we once used to sacrifice animals on the altar of the temple, and the temple is gone, and so in honor of the loss, we will no longer eat meat. And also they added, almost as if they live in San Francisco, we're not going to drink wine because in the temple, wine was used as a libation, and the temple is no more, so no more wine. Rabbi Yehoshua thought about this, and then he said, then you probably shouldn't eat bread either, because you know we also offered flour at the temple. And the students stood up straight and they cleared their throats and they said, you're right. From now on, we will sustain ourselves on fruit. But Rabbi Yehoshua said, you know, we probably should not eat fruit because, you know, sacrifice of the first fruits. The students said, you're right. We will not eat of the 7 species of fruits that we once brought to the temple, and will just subsist on the other kinds of fruit. We can live on that. And Rabbi Yehoshua thought, and he said, I hate to bring this up, but we used to pour water on the altar of the temple, for the water libation. And then the students were quiet because they knew they could not live without water. Then Rabbi Yehoshua gathered them close and he said, listen, let me tell you what we will do. It's not possible not to mourn. There was a decree. We're commanded. And also we're heartbroken that so much has changed and we can no longer do what we once did. And we wonder, even if we could do it again, by the time we can do it again, we ourselves might be different by then. And so it's natural for us to want to grieve so much for everything that we stop living altogether. But our teachers have taught us that we cannot issue a ruling unless the majority of the people can sustain it. The way to grieve cannot be to not eat anything and not drink anything. The way to grieve cannot be so harsh that we cannot live. See, we need both. Yes, we need to grieve. We need to think of these very difficult things. We need to consider the loss, but we also need to live. And as we live, of course, we're still living through this time. We must comfort one another. We must remember that each of us is more vulnerable and more frightened and more aware of our dependency. We must summon generosity and chesed like never before. We must be fountains of generosity and springs of kindness for one another. And as we live, we must also remember, even now, that comfort is not enough. Not in our kitchen community, and not when our country is so broken and the injustice of our systems is so exposed. See, now that we understand we have the gift of our lives, we have been given again the gift of our lives, then we also must understand that we have a chance to move beyond platitudes and slogans and smoke and mirrors and false optimism based on shallow diagnoses. We have an opportunity to really fix the problems around us and in our country. There's a midrash, and it's one I've been thinking about all year. It's about King Solomon. And you see, Solomon was very wise. Maybe you heard of that. He was one of the wisest leaders our people has ever known. And he was also very diplomatic and strategic. In fact, he was so diplomatic, he used to marry princesses, one from each of a whole host of countries, just to keep ties with those countries. I didn't say he was perfect, I just said he was diplomatic. In fact, tradition condemns him for this accumulation of wealth and of horses and of material possessions, not to mention people/wives. But I digress. Anyway, one night, turns out the very night Solomon completed work on the temple. You can imagine how much went into this and what a moment it would be. Surely the culmination of all the efforts in his life, not to mention the efforts of many other people. On that same night, it turns out he was also getting married to yet another princess, daughter of Pharaoh. Of course, this is many, many years later after the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt. But you would think such a marriage on all nights would raise an eyebrow or two. However, not only was no one bothered, the sources say that the celebration for the wedding was a little bit more joyous than the celebration for the new temple. That's what it was like in that time. Not only that, but that night, Pharaoh's daughter ordered 1,000 musical instruments to be played, and she spent time teaching Solomon the names of each and every idol that went with each of the 1,000 instruments. And not only that, but Pharaoh's daughter also put a canopy right over Solomon's bed, encrusted with all kinds of precious stones and pearls that shimmered like stars and planets, so that all during the night and into the next morning, whenever Solomon was about to wake up for the day, he thought he was seeing the night sky, and he just kept going back to sleep again and again. And the next morning, as every hour went by, Israel outside the community was grieving and continuing to grieve, because after all that waiting and all that building, although they finally had a new temple, although it was the official day of the consecration, the offering could not be brought. Nobody could pray or seek justice or peace, because King Solomon was asleep, and so in awe were they of his position and royalty, nobody dared to wake him up. And Solomon slept and slept, and the keys to the temple were under his head. I think we in America, pre-corona, and even now, I think we're like Solomon. We have great wisdom, talent, and resources, everything beyond measure. We are one of the richest countries to ever exist. But bit by bit, over many years and over many decisions, we have squandered our integrity and our values and our dream of freedom for all. Now all we have is the equivalent of 1,000 songs for 1,000 idols. Now through the lens of the pandemic, it is clear we cannot say we are a society that provides for the many. We can only say we have accumulated far too much for the very few. The holiest places are within our reach, but we cannot enter them because we are half asleep, and we are afraid even to admit we let things get this far. So we pretend the country is better than it is, and we pretend all kinds of shiny objects are stars so we don't have to wake up. We need to comfort each other, yes. But we also need to realize the keys are under our heads. We need to use this moment to look at what truths are rising to the surface, what our country has really become, how we do and do not use our power. Because if we do not look, if we are not honest, the king will stay asleep, we will stay asleep, barely conscious, surrounded by decoys, and anything we might learn from this costly chapter in our history will be quickly forgotten. Thank God for Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, who, as soon as she hears what's going on, barges into Solomon's room and yells at him saying, "Is this who you want to be? Is this what you want for our world? Is this how I raised you? Are you so willing to throw everything away?" We have to comfort each other now. Yes, I know, we're grieving. We're grieving for lost people and lost events, pieces of our lives that are elemental and fundamental. We have to comfort each other, but we also must, like Bathsheba, with love for one another and for this country, tell one another the truth, wake one another up. We can't afford to be distracted by the spectacles, and there will be more spectacles than ever, and we cannot afford to be overly awed by royalty or anyone who doesn't consistently work to earn our trust. We must instead remember who we wanted to be in this country and the daring promise of justice for all. It says in Shir Shirim, Song of Songs, that Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, gives Solomon a crown on his wedding day. Only, says Rab Isaac, I looked all up and down, all over Tanakh, all over Torah, and I can't find that verse. It's actually not mentioned anywhere. So on this Shabbat, I'm here to say to Rab Isaac and to us, the crown that Bathsheba gave to Solomon is right here in our story. When, out of love for family and God and country, she demands that Solomon wake up and find the keys. See, Bathsheba does give Solomon a crown. She gives him the crown of truth. She gives him the crown of responsibility. It is heavy, that crown. It's not so easy to wear, but we know, those of us here know, it is the only crown worth having.